What happens when the systems designed to protect you become the source of your deepest terror? Tonight, we're not talking about a stranger in a dark alley. We're talking about a man in a crisp uniform, a protector of the peace and a pillar of the community. We tell the story of a routine stop at a bank ATM that spirals into a life-or-death confrontation. It's a story about perception, prejudice, and the terrifying speed at which a life can be devalued. But stick with us, because the moment a gun is drawn is only the beginning. The real story is what happens next, when the bank's doors fly open and a single frantic scream changes everything, setting in motion a chain of events that will deliver a form of karma so precise, so devastating it's almost poetic. The Tuesday night air in the suburbs of Northern Virginia carried the first real bite of late autumn. David Sterling felt it seep through his grey hoodie as he stepped out of his car. The parking lot of the Meridian Trust Bank was mostly empty, bathed in the sterile orange glow of sodium lamps that did little to warm the scene. It was just past 9 p.m. The world had settled into a quiet hum, the kind of peace David usually cherished after a long day of navigating the complex world of corporate finance. He was the Senior Vice President of Community Development for this very bank, Meridian Trust. It was a title that came with a corner office, a heavy weight of responsibility, and a salary that afforded him a comfortable life in a gated community a few miles away. But tonight, he wasn't a VP. He was just a man in a hoodie and jeans, needing to withdraw a couple $100 for the handyman coming to fix the deck in the morning. His wife, Imani, had reminded him twice. The ATM vestibule was a small glass box, an island of light in the dark lot. As David inserted his card, the machine whirred to life, its familiar electronic chimes, a small comfort. He keyed in his PIN, his mind already drifting to the presentation he had to finalize for the board on Friday. It was a proposal for a new microloan initiative aimed at supporting minority-owned small businesses, a project he had poured his heart and soul into for the better part of a year. It was his baby, his way of using his position to build bridges, not just balance sheets. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he didn't immediately register the headlights that swept across the vestibule, far brighter and harsher than a normal car's. They didn't pass by. They stopped pinning him in their glare. He squinted, a flicker of annoyance passing through him. Then he saw the silhouette of the vehicle, a police cruiser. A knot tightened in his stomach. It was a familiar feeling, one he hadn't experienced in years, but one that never truly left a black man in America. It was the sudden, unwelcome awareness of his own skin, the cold realization that his presence alone could be interpreted as a threat. He was a 42-year-old executive, a husband, a father to a teenage daughter, a respected member of his church. But in this moment, bathed in the accusatory light of a police car, he felt stripped of all of it. The ATM dispensed his cash. As he tucked the crisp $20 bills into his wallet, the cruiser's door opened with a decisive heavy click. David's heart rate kicked up a notch. Just stay calm. You've done nothing wrong. It was a mantra he had mentally recited more times than he could count since he was a boy. A police officer emerged, a man whose features were obscured by the blinding headlights behind him. He was a solid shape of authority, moving with a deliberate, almost predatory slowness. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the vestibule." The officer's voice boomed, sharp and devoid of any pleasantry. It wasn't a request. David took a slow breath, holding his hands up in a gesture of non-confrontation, his wallet still in one hand. "Of course, officer. Is there a problem?" He stepped out onto the cold asphalt. The officer was closer now. He was white, maybe in his late 30s, with a stern, clean-shaven face and eyes that seemed to be assessing David not as a person, but as a collection of potential risks. His name tag read Miller. We had a report of suspicious activity in this area. Officer Miller said, his gaze flicking from David's face to his hoodie to the slight bulge of the wallet in his hand. Someone matching your description. David's mind raced. Suspicious activity. Matching my description. The description was painfully obvious. A black man. There was no one else here. Officer, I was just using the ATM. I bank here. I can show you my debit card, my driver's license. He made a slow, deliberate move to reach for his back pocket to retrieve the wallet he had just put away. Freeze hands where I can see them. Miller's voice cracked like a whip. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifyingly swift. Before David could even process the command, Officer Miller had unholstered his firearm. The click of the safety being disengaged was a sound so final, so absolute, it seemed to suck all the air out of the night. The dark, unforgiving circle at the end of the barrel was pointed directly at David's chest. Time seemed to warp. The orange lamps, the hum of the ATM, the distant traffic, it all faded into a roaring in David's ears. All he could see was the gun. All he could feel was the cold dread flooding his veins. His daughter's face flashed in his mind. Imane's. The microloan project. A lifetime of achievement, of careful planning, of being the good guy was about to be extinguished in a sterile bank parking lot because a man in a hoodie looked suspicious. Don't move. Miller barked his own voice, tight with adrenaline. Put the object in your hand on the ground. Slowly. The object was his wallet. David's mind screamed with the injustice, the sheer absurdity of it. But his body knew the rules of this deadly game. He complied, bending his knees slowly and placing his leather wallet on the gritty asphalt as if it were a bomb. On your knees, Miller commanded. David's own pride, his very sense of self, rebelled. On my knees. For what? For being a customer. But the gun in Miller's hand was unwavering. This wasn't a debate. It was a matter of survival. As his knees touched the cold, hard ground, a profound sense of humiliation washed over him, so potent it almost eclipsed the fear. He could hear the officer speaking into his shoulder radio, his voice a low, urgent murmur. Have a suspect at gunpoint. Possible 211 in progress. A 211, armed robbery. David felt a surge of helpless anger. He was being painted as a criminal in real time. Inside the bank, the lights were on, in the back offices. Sarah Jenkins, the branch manager, was working late, reconciling the day's accounts. She was a meticulous woman in her 50s, dedicated to her job to a fault. She was just about to call it a night, when she heard the faint but unmistakable sound of a commanding shout through the thick glass of the front doors. Curiosity turned to concern. She walked from her office to the front lobby, peering through the tinted glass. What she saw made her blood run cold. She saw the flashing lights of a police car. She saw one of her regular customers, a man she knew only as David, who was always polite on his knees. And she saw an officer with his gun drawn, aimed squarely at him. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She knew the officer too. Miller. He had a reputation for being aggressive, for seeing trouble where there was none. But this was beyond the pale. She felt a jolt of panic, not just for the man on the ground, but for the bank, for herself. Then her brain made the connection. The man's face. David. The memo from corporate last month. The smiling picture in the internal newsletter. The announcement of the new Senior VP of Community Development, David Sterling. The man who was, in effect, one of her ultimate bosses. The man who held the fate of her branch's community outreach programs in his hands. A strangled gasp escaped her lips. The reconciliation reports, the late hour, everything vanished. There was only the horrific scene unfolding in her parking lot. She didn't think. She acted. She fumbled with the locks on the front door, her hands shaking. With a frantic shove, she burst out into the cold night air. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice raw with panic and adrenaline. "Oh my God! Stop! Officer Miller, what are you doing?" Officer Miller, startled by the sudden eruption, flinched. He half-turned his weapon, still trained on David, his face a mask of confusion and annoyance. "Ma'am, stay back. This is an active crime scene." Sarah Jenkins didn't stop. She ran towards them, her sensible work heels clattering on the asphalt, her face pale with terror. "A crime scene? Are you insane?" she yelled, her voice trembling but fierce. She pointed a shaking finger at David, who was still on his knees, his face a mixture of shock and dawning disbelief. "That's not a criminal!" she shrieked, the words tumbling out in a torrent of pure, unadulterated panic. "That's David Sterling. That's our vice president." The words hung in the cold night air, supercharged with adrenaline and disbelief. "That's our vice president." For a moment, all three of them were frozen in a tableau of shock. David, still on his knees, looked from the frantic face of Sarah Jenkins to the suddenly uncertain eyes of Officer Miller. The barrel of the Glock, which had seemed like the center of the universe moments before, wavered. Officer Miller's brain struggled to reconcile the two realities. The reality he had constructed, a potential armed robber, a suspicious figure in a hoodie, and the one Sarah Jenkins had just screamed into existence, a bank VP. The two images were utterly incompatible. His aggressive posture faltered. The certainty that had guided his actions just seconds ago evaporated, replaced by a dawning, sickening sense of dread. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he lowered his weapon. He didn't holster it immediately, as if letting go of it would be an admission of a catastrophic error. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down," he said, his voice losing its authoritative edge, now tinged with a defensive quaver. "Calm down." Sarah was breathless, gesturing wildly at David. "You have a gun pointed at Mr. Sterling. He's one of the heads of this entire bank." David finally found his voice, a low, strained sound. "You can check my ID now, officer. It's in the wallet, on the ground." The humiliation of it all felt like a physical weight. Miller holstered his gun with a final decisive click that sounded entirely different from the one that had started the ordeal. It was a sound of retreat, of failure. He took a hesitant step forward and nudged the wallet with his foot before picking it up. He opened it, his fingers fumbling slightly. He pulled out the Meridian Trust Bank corporate card, with its gold lettering and embossed title, David Sterling, Senior Vice President. Then he saw the driver's license confirming the name and a home address in the affluent Willow Creek Estates. A wave of cold sweat broke out on Miller's brow. This was not a vagrant. This was not a stick-up artist. This was a man with power. A man who could end his career with a single phone call. "Oh," was all he could manage to say. He looked at David, who was slowly pushing himself up from the ground, his knees aching, his dark jeans stained with grime. The officer's face, which had been a mask of stern authority, was now pale and slack-jawed. "Sir, there was a call. A call about what exactly?" David asked, his voice dangerously quiet. He brushed the dust from his knees, his movements stiff. The adrenaline was beginning to recede, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep tremor of rage and hurt. "Suspicious individual. Loitering near the ATM." Miller stammered, the official language sounding absurd now. "I was here for less than 2 minutes," David stated flatly. "I used the machine and was about to leave. Is being a black man in a hoodie suspicious activity in Northern Virginia?" The directness of the question struck Miller like a physical blow. He had no answer. There was no policy or procedure he could hide behind. There was only the raw, ugly truth of his own assumptions. "Sir, I was following protocol." "Your protocol is to draw your weapon on a customer making a withdrawal." David shot back, his voice rising for the first time. Sarah Jenkins stepped between them, playing peacemaker, though her loyalty was clear. "Officer, maybe it's best if we go inside. We can sort this out." Miller, looking desperate for any exit, nodded quickly. Yes, let's go inside." The walk into the bank was the most surreal experience of David's life. He, the VP, was being escorted by the panicked branch manager and the police officer who had just held him at gunpoint. Inside, the bright, professional environment of the bank lobby felt like a different universe from the dark parking lot. Sarah led them to her office, a glass-walled room with pictures of her grandchildren on the desk. She offered David a chair, which he took, feeling the strength drain from his legs. Miller remained standing, shifting his weight, his eyes darting around the room, unable to meet David's gaze. "Mr. Sterling, I am so sorry." Sarah began, her voice still shaky. "I don't know what to say. I saw the lights, I heard the shouting." "You did the right thing, Sarah," David said, his voice softening slightly as he looked at her. "Thank you. If you hadn't come out..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Miller cleared his throat. "Sir, Mr. Sterling, I apologize. It was a mistake. A misunderstanding." David looked at him. Really looked at him for the first time, without a gun between them. He saw a man terrified of the consequences, not a man who understood the depth of his error. The apology was hollow, a self-preservation reflex. "A misunderstanding," David repeated, his voice laced with ice. "You pointed a loaded weapon at my heart, Officer Miller. You had me on my knees on the asphalt. You publicly accused me of being a robber. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a choice. You made a choice the moment you saw me." "I was responding to a call," Miller insisted weakly. "I have to take all calls seriously." "Who made the call?" David pressed. Miller hesitated. "It was an anonymous tip. An anonymous tip. The classic, unverifiable excuse. It meant nothing and everything. It meant someone could have seen a black man and called the police, and Miller had taken that bias and amplified it into a near-fatal encounter. "I want your name and badge number," David said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And I want the name of your commanding officer." Miller recited the information, his voice monotone. The power dynamic had completely inverted. He was no longer the enforcer. He was the subject of an impending investigation, and he knew it. After Miller had been dismissed, practically scurrying out of the bank, Sarah offered David a bottle of water. His hands were still trembling as he took it. "David, what are you going to do?" she asked softly. He stared into the middle distance, the scene replaying in his mind, the headlights, the shout, the black hole of the gun's barrel. "I'm going to do what any citizen should do," he said, his resolve hardening. I'm filing a formal complaint with the department, with the city, with everyone who will listen. This isn't about me being a VP, Sarah. This is about what would have happened if I wasn't. What if I was just some kid from the neighborhood? Would I be sitting here right now? Or would my parents be getting a knock on their door? The drive home was a blur. He called Imani, his voice tight, trying to downplay the severity of it. But she knew him too well. The moment he walked through the door, she saw it in his eyes, the haunted look. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly. "Tell me everything," she whispered. He did. He told her about the cold ground, the humiliation, the sheer primal fear. He told her about the look in Miller's eyes, the casual assumption of his guilt. As he spoke, the tough exterior of the corporate executive crumbled, and he was just a man who had been terrified for his life. Imani held him, her own eyes blazing with a fierce, protective anger. "They're not going to get away with this, David," she said, her voice like steel. They picked the wrong man this time. The next morning, David Sterling, dressed not in a hoodie, but in a sharp, tailored suit that bespoke his status, walked into the Northam Police Department. He wasn't just a citizen filing a complaint anymore. He was a man with resources, with a voice, and with a story that could expose a rot that went far deeper than one officer's bad judgment. The apology in the bank office had been hollow, but the consequences, David vowed, would be anything but. He was about to learn, however, that the system designed to police itself is often its own best defender. The Northam Police Department was a fortress of beige brick and tinted windows, designed to project an image of impenetrable order. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of stale coffee and bureaucracy. David Sterling, sitting in the Spartan waiting area of the Internal Affairs Division, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the overzealous air conditioning. His meeting was with Captain Frank Hayes, the head of Internal Affairs. Hayes was a man who looked like he had been poured into his uniform and left to set. He had a thick neck, a graying crew cut, and a face that seemed permanently fixed in a mask of weary skepticism. He greeted David with a firm handshake and an expression that was professionally somber, but his eyes were guarded. "Mr. Sterling," Hayes began once they were seated in his sterile office. "First, let me offer the department's sincerest apologies for your experience. What you described in your complaint is deeply concerning and not reflective of the standards we hold our officers to." It was the perfectly polished, corporate-approved apology. David had delivered similar statements himself on behalf of Meridian Trust. He knew it for what it was, a prelude to damage control. "Captain," David said, his tone even, "I appreciate the sentiment, but I'm less interested in apologies and more interested in accountability. Officer Miller didn't just fail to meet standards. He endangered my life based on a prejudice. What is the department going to do about it?" Captain Hayes steepled his fingers. "A full and thorough investigation is already underway. Officer Miller has been placed on administrative duty pending the outcome." "Administrative duty?" David asked. "So he's at a desk instead of on the street. He's still collecting a paycheck." "It's standard procedure, Mr. Sterling," Hayes said smoothly. "We must respect the officer's right to due process, just as we respect your right to file a complaint. We are pulling the dispatch logs, the anonymous call records if they exist, and Officer Miller's bodycam footage." The mention of bodycam footage gave David a flicker of hope. "The footage will corroborate everything I've said." "I'm sure it will," Hayes said, his expression unreadable. "And we will take the appropriate disciplinary action based on our findings." The meeting concluded with more platitudes and promises of transparency. David left the station feeling profoundly unsatisfied. He had been managed. He felt the invisible gears of the institution beginning to turn, not to find justice, but to absorb the blow and protect itself. The blue wall of silence. He knew wasn't just a myth. It was a living, breathing organism, and he had just walked into its heart. Weeks turned into a month. David received a formal letter from the department stating that the investigation was ongoing. He heard through back channels that Officer Miller was still on desk duty. At the bank, the incident was the unspoken elephant in every room. The corporate headquarters had issued a statement supporting him, but David could sense their primary concern was avoiding a lawsuit and bad press. The world was moving on, expecting him to do the same. But he couldn't. The memory of the gun barrel was seared into his mind. He found himself more anxious, more jumpy. He'd see a police car in his rearview mirror, and his hands would clench the steering wheel. The incident had left a crack in his foundation, a constant reminder of his vulnerability. Imani saw the change in him, the way he sometimes stared off into the distance, and her anger simmered. The official conclusion came nearly 2 months after the incident. A thick envelope arrived from the Northam PD. Inside, a jargon-filled letter informed him that the investigation was complete. It stated that Officer Miller had acted within the bounds of departmental policy regarding potential felony stops, but had failed to de-escalate the situation in a timely manner. His bodycam footage, the letter explained, had experienced a technical malfunction and did not record the initial interaction. The punishment officer Miller would be required to attend a mandatory 4-hour de-escalation training course and would have a formal reprimand placed in his permanent file. David read the letter twice, then a third time, a cold, bitter fury rising in him. A technical malfunction, a 4-hour class. It was a complete and utter whitewash. They had buried it. Captain Hayes, with his somber face and empty promises, had played his part perfectly. The system had protected its own. He slammed the letter down on his kitchen island. Imani read it over his shoulder, her silence more potent than any shout. "They're mocking you," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "They think you're just going to accept this and go away." "That's exactly what they think," David said, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a sense of deep cynicism. "What more can I do, Imani? I filed the complaint. I went through the channels. The system is rigged." "Then you go around the system," she countered, her eyes flashing. "This isn't just about you anymore, David. This is about the next person Miller pulls over. The one who isn't a bank VP. The one whose manager doesn't come running out." Her words resonated with the very reasons he'd started his microloan project. He couldn't let it go. He couldn't let Miller win. That evening, feeling defeated, he was scrolling through a local online news forum when a name caught his eye. Jessica Finn. She was an independent investigative journalist who ran a small but respected blog called the Northam Sentinel. She had a reputation for digging into stories the mainstream media outlets deemed too controversial or complex, particularly stories about local government and police misconduct. She had recently broken a story about financial mismanagement in the city council that had led to a state audit. On a long shot, David opened his email. He hesitated for a long moment, then began to type. He wrote everything down, from the chill of the night air to the hollow words in the official letter. He attached a scanned copy of the letter and hit send, not expecting much. To his surprise, an email appeared in his inbox less than an hour later. "Mr. Sterling, thank you for reaching out. I remember when the initial sanitized version of this story broke. The department's conclusion is unfortunately not surprising. I would be very interested in speaking with you further. The name Officer Miller is one I've encountered before. Jessica Finn. A new spark of hope, fragile but real, ignited within David. The last line of her email was a hook, a name I've encountered before. They met 2 days later in a small coffee shop far from David's neighborhood and the bank. Jessica Finn was in her late 20s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She had an air of restless energy, her notebook already open on the table. "Mr. Sterling," she said, shaking his hand. "Thank you for trusting me with this." "David, please," he said, "and thank you for responding. I was at a dead end." "Dead ends are usually where the real story begins," she said with a wry smile. "The department's report is a work of art. The malfunctioning body cam is the oldest trick in the book. It gives them plausible deniability. But it also tells me they have something to hide." "You said you've heard of Miller before?" David asked, leaning forward. Jessica's expression turned serious. "Yes. A couple of years ago I was covering a story about a string of aggressive stop-and-frisks in the Oakhaven district, a predominantly minority neighborhood. Miller's name came up in my interviews, but never on an official complaint. People were afraid to go on the record. They knew nothing would happen. Or worse, they'd be targeted. He has a reputation for being a proactive cop, which is usually departmental code for someone who pushes the boundaries." She tapped her pen on her notebook. "This is different, though. You're not someone they can easily dismiss. You have standing, you have resources. They can't just intimidate you into silence. By trying to bury this, they've made a mistake. They've made it a bigger story." "What can you do?" David asked. "I can dig," she said, her eyes glinting with determination. "I can file FOIA requests for every complaint ever filed against Miller, redacted or not. I can look for patterns. I can search court records for cases he was involved in. I can try to find the other people who were afraid to speak up. A single incident is a misunderstanding. A pattern of behavior is a policy of abuse." For the first time since the incident, David felt like he wasn't alone. He had found an ally, someone who saw the system with the same clear-eyed cynicism he now did. "What do you need from me?" David asked. "Your story, on the record, everything, and your patience," she said. "The kind of information I'm looking for is buried deep. It's going to take time to unearth it. But trust me, we will." As David left the coffee shop, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. The official channels had failed him, but a new unofficial one had just opened up. The fight wasn't over. It had just all changed battlefields, and he had a feeling that Jessica Finn was a formidable warrior. Jessica Finn worked like a surgeon with precision patience and a refusal to be intimidated by the institutional body she was dissecting. For the next 2 months, she became a phantom thorn in the side of the Northam city government. Her first move was a barrage of Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) requests. She asked for Officer Alan Miller's personnel file, all civilian complaints filed against him, his use of force reports, and any documents related to the technical malfunction of his body camera on the night of the incident with David. The pushback was immediate and predictable. The city attorney's office sent back heavily redacted documents citing privacy concerns and ongoing personnel matters. Miller's file was mostly black lines. The bodycam report was a single page stating the unit had been sent for diagnostics and returned with a no fault found conclusion, a convenient contradiction. But Jessica was an expert at reading the spaces between the black lines. She saw the dates of the complaints, even if the details were obscured. She saw a pattern, 5 complaints in 3 years, all from the Oakhaven district she had investigated before. All of them had been dismissed as unfounded. Working from those dates, she cross-referenced them with arrest records from the Northam Courthouse archives. It was a painstaking process, but she found 2 cases that had gone to trial where Miller was the arresting officer. She pulled the transcripts. In one, a defense attorney had grilled Miller on the stand about his justification for a traffic stop that led to a minor drug charge. The defendant claimed Miller had profiled him. The judge had ultimately sided with the officer, but the seed was there. The real breakthrough came from an old-fashioned source, shoe leather reporting. With David's reluctant permission, he didn't want to put anyone else at risk. Jessica went back to the Oakhaven district. She didn't go as a journalist at first. She went to community meetings, volunteered at a local food bank, and just listened. She carried the name Officer Miller like a key waiting for the right lock. She found it in a barber shop. An old barber named Gus, who had seen everything in his 60 years on the same corner, recognized the name. Miller. Oh yeah, we know Miller. Calls himself the Sheriff of Oakhaven. Thinks every kid with a backpack is holding and every car with tinted windows is stolen. Gus pointed her to a young man named Marcus, whose cousin had been arrested by Miller a year ago. The charge was resisting arrest. Marcus told Jessica the real story. My cousin Jamal was just leaning on his own car, listening to music. Miller rolls up, tells him to move along. Jamal asks why. Miller doesn't like being questioned. Grabs him, slams him against the car. Tacks on resisting when Jamal flinches. It was garbage, but who's going to believe a kid from this neighborhood over a cop? Jamal's case was one of the redacted complaints. He had been scared into a plea deal and was still on probation. But with Jessica's assurance that he wouldn't be alone, that a bank VP was now involved, he agreed to talk. His story was eerily similar to David's minus the gun, but with added physical aggression. One source led to another. A woman whose son was ticketed for loitering on his own front porch. A man who was pulled from his car and searched because he looked nervous. A pattern emerged clear and undeniable. Officer Miller treated minority communities, particularly Oakhaven, as his personal fiefdom, a place where constitutional rights were suggestions, not requirements. While Jessica was digging into Miller's past, David was dealing with the subtle corrosive effects of the incident on his own life. At work, he pushed his microloan initiative, now named the Phoenix Fund, with a renewed, almost ferocious passion. It was no longer just a good business idea. It was his answer to the poison of prejudice. It was his way of building up what men like Miller sought to tear down. But the internal politics were treacherous. Some board members saw his passion as a personal vendetta. One senior executive even took him aside and advised him to let the police matter go for the good of the bank's relationship with the city. David realized with dawning horror that some of his colleagues were more afraid of rocking the boat than they were of the injustice that had happened to him. This corporate cowardice only hardened his resolve. He gave Jessica the green light to use his name, his title, everything. The time for quiet diplomacy was over. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that would turn the story from an exposé into a bombshell, came from an anonymous source inside the Northam PD. It was an email sent through an encrypted service to the generic contact address for Jessica's blog. You're looking at the Miller case. You're on the right track, but you're missing the big lie. They didn't just bury the complaint. They fabricated evidence. There was no anonymous call. Check the dispatch logs for the half hour before the Sterling incident. Then check Miller's patrol car, GPS data. He wasn't dispatched. He was already there. Jessica's heart pounded as she read the message. This was it. The twist. If Miller wasn't responding to a call, his entire justification for the stop, the very foundation of the department's report, was a lie. He had initiated the contact himself purely based on seeing David at the ATM. She filed another, more specific FOIA request, this time for the raw dispatch audio and GPS logs for Miller's cruiser for a specific 1-hour window. The city attorney's office delayed, claiming the request was overly broad and burdensome. Jessica responded by publishing her first article, A Tale of Two Citizens Northam PD Clears Officer in Gunpoint Incident with Bank VP, but a pattern of harassment emerges. The story was explosive. It detailed David's encounter in chilling detail. It featured the on-the-record testimony of Jamal and 2 other Oak Haven residents. It laid out the pattern of dismissed complaints. And it publicly called out the police department for withholding the body cam footage and now the dispatch logs. The article went viral locally. It was picked up by news outlets in Richmond, then Washington, D.C. The Northam PD, which had hoped to suffocate the story with silence, was now caught in a firestorm. The pressure mounted. City council members, smelling a scandal, started making calls. Under immense public pressure, the department released the logs. Jessica and David sat in his home office, looking at the data on her laptop screen. The dispatch log for the 30 minutes before the incident was filled with routine traffic stops and a minor noise complaint on the other side of town. There was no suspicious person call for the area around Meridian Trust Bank. Nothing. Then she pulled up the GPS data. The little digital icon representing Miller's cruiser told the whole story. He hadn't been on patrol in a different area and been dispatched to the bank. For 10 minutes prior to his interaction with David, his car had been parked in the shadows of an adjacent strip mall with a direct line of sight to the ATM. He had been watching, waiting. He saw David, a black man in a hoodie, and decided on his own to make his move. He had lied. He had lied to David, he had lied to Sarah Jenkins, and he had lied in his official report. He had committed perjury. And then came the twist of the knife. The final karmic detail that Jessica uncovered while doing a deep background check on Officer Alan Miller. It was a piece of public information filed away in the county clerk's office that no one had thought to connect. She found his mortgage documents. Officer Alan Miller, the man who policed the streets with an iron fist, was in deep financial trouble. He had refinanced his home twice in 5 years, and the lender holding the mortgage on his underwater property in a neighboring suburb was none other than Meridian Trust Bank. Jessica looked at David, her face a mixture of shock and grim satisfaction. David, Miller's mortgage. It's with you. With Meridian Trust. David stared at her, the information slowly sinking in. And it gets worse, she said, pulling up another document. He's 90 days behind on his payments. The irony was staggering. Officer Miller, in his presumed role as a protector of property and order, was on the verge of defaulting on his own obligations to the very institution his victim represented. According to the bank's standard procedures, a file for a mortgage 90 days in arrears would automatically be flagged for review by the Regional Risk Management Division. That division's reports were ultimately funneled upwards. High-risk or particularly sensitive cases like that of a police officer involved in a public scandal would eventually land on the desk of one person for final review before legal proceedings began. That person was David Sterling, the Senior Vice President of Community Development. The publication of Jessica Finn's second article, The Miller Deception, GPS. Data proves Northam officer lied in official report. Fabricated justification for gunpoint confrontation was not a firecracker, it was a detonation. The story laid out the evidence with cold, irrefutable clarity. The lack of a dispatch call, the GPS data showing Miller's car lying in wait, the sworn testimony from other victims. The article concluded with the stunning revelation that Officer Miller had falsified his official report, a criminal offense. The fallout was swift and brutal. The Northam Police Department, its credibility shredded, had nowhere left to hide. Captain Hayes, the man who had assured David of a full and thorough investigation, was publicly humiliated. The chief of police, a man who rarely spoke to the media, was forced to hold a press conference. Standing before a wall of cameras, looking pale and beleaguered, he announced that Officer Alan Miller had been suspended without pay and was now the subject of a criminal investigation to be handled by the state police for perjury and official misconduct. For Officer Miller, the world collapsed. The blue wall that had protected him for his entire career crumbled into dust. His fellow officers, who might have privately sympathized, now saw him as a liability, a man who got caught and brought a storm down on all of them. The phone calls stopped. The supportive texts vanished. He was an island. His wife, who had stood by him through years of complaints she'd dismissed as the ramblings of criminals, finally saw the truth. Jessica's article didn't just paint him as a bad cop. It painted him as a liar. The foundation of their life together was his word, and his word was now proven to be worthless. The argument in their home was volcanic. She saw the incident not as a one-time mistake, but as the ultimate symptom of an arrogance and prejudice he had always carried. A week after the story broke, she packed her bags and left with their 2 children. Stripped of his job, his income, and his family, Miller was a man adrift. He hired a lawyer with what little savings he had, but the case against him was airtight. The perjury charge was a slam dunk. His career in law enforcement was not just over, it was scorched earth. And then the hard karma, the kind that works not with a bang, but with the quiet, inexorable turning of bureaucratic gears, delivered its final, most precise blow. In his office at Meridian Trust, David Sterling sat before a file on his desk. It was flagged with a red tab high-priority delinquency review. The name on the file was Alan and Stacy Miller. He saw the address, the loan amount, the shocking number of missed payments. He saw the notes from the lower-level managers recommending the initiation of foreclosure proceedings. His first instinct was a surge of triumphant satisfaction. Here it was, the ultimate power. He could, with the stroke of a pen sign, off on the recommendation. He could take this man's house, the final pillar of his collapsing life. It would be justice, wouldn't it? An eye for an eye. You threatened my life and my dignity. I'll take your home. The poetry of it was seductive. He thought about the cold asphalt on his knees. He thought about the fear, the humiliation. He thought about the smirking certainty in Miller's eyes, now replaced by the panicked desperation of a man who had lost everything. He picked up the phone and called Jessica. "I have his foreclosure file on my desk," David said, his voice flat. There was a moment of silence on the other end. "Wow," Jessica breathed. "That's Shakespearean. What are you going to do?" "That's what I'm asking myself," David confessed. "Part of me wants to sign it and feel the satisfaction of it. But what does that make me? It feels like using power in the same way he did. To crush someone." "You wouldn't be wrong to do it, David," Jessica said softly. "It's not personal. It's business. He didn't pay his mortgage. That's the system he believed in, isn't it? Personal responsibility." She was right, but it didn't feel right. Over the past few months, his focus had shifted. The Phoenix Fund was about to launch a program designed to give people a second chance to invest in communities that the system had written off. If he were to use his power for personal revenge, even a legally justified one. It would poison the very thing he was trying to build. It would make him a hypocrite. "Revenge isn't the answer," David said, more to himself than to Jessica. "It's not about him anymore. It's about me. It's about what I do with this power I have." He hung up the phone and stared at the file. He knew what he had to do. He would not stop the foreclosure. As Jessica said, it was a legitimate business process. Miller had defaulted, and there were consequences for that. The bank, its shareholders, and its procedures demanded it. He would not abuse his power to halt the process, nor would he abuse it to accelerate it. He would treat the Alan Miller file like any other. He would sign off on the recommendation based on the financial facts, not the personal history. He signed the form, his hand steady. It wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of impartiality, the very thing Miller had denied him on that cold night. He was upholding the system, the fair and unbiased application of rules. But he did one more thing. He pulled out a piece of his personal stationery. He wrote a short, anonymous note. "Your file came across my desk. I could have stopped it or pushed it through with prejudice. I did neither. I treated you like any other number on a page with the impartiality you denied me. That is the beginning and end of my involvement in your life. The consequences you now face are not my revenge. They are the harvest of the seeds you planted long ago. I hope for your sake you one day understand that." He sealed the note and arranged for it to be anonymously delivered to Miller. The karma that hit Alan Miller wasn't the loss of his house. That was just a financial transaction. The hard karma, the blow that would truly break him, was in that note. It was the realization that his fate had been held in the hands of the very man he had victimized, and that man had chosen not vengeance but principle. He had been judged not by a hateful enemy, but by a dispassionate system. He wasn't important enough for revenge. He was just a defaulted loan, a failure. His professional ruin came from his lies. His personal ruin came from his arrogance. His financial ruin came from his irresponsibility. And his spiritual ruin came from the knowledge that David Sterling had taken the moral high ground, leaving Miller alone in the wreckage of his own making, with no one to blame but himself. He was not a victim of a vengeful VP. He was simply the architect of his own demise. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a cop and a VP. It was a story about two different kinds of power. The power that comes from a badge and a gun used to intimidate and assume the worst in people. And the power that comes from a position of influence used not for revenge, but to uphold a principle even when it's difficult. David Sterling could have become a mirror of the man who wronged him, using his power to crush his opponent. But instead, he chose a different path. He let the system, a fair and impartial one, deliver the consequences, while he turned his energy to building something positive with his Phoenix Fund. The hard karma that hit Officer Miller wasn't a single event, but a total collapse brought on by his own actions, his own lies, and his own prejudices. His story serves as a stark reminder that the choices we make, especially how we treat others, eventually circle back. Sometimes the most devastating karma isn't a dramatic act of vengeance. It's being forced to live with the unvarnished consequences of who you are. What would you have done in David's shoes? Is this the kind of justice you find satisfying? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you and made you think, please help our channel grow by hitting that like button, sharing this video with someone who appreciates deep storytelling, and most importantly, subscribing for more content that goes beyond the headlines. Thank you for listening.